The moment I stumbled across the tickets, my world tilted. It wasn't a sudden earth-shattering revelation, but a slow creeping sense of disbelief. They sat innocently on the kitchen counter, tucked under a pile of his mail, their glossy surface catching the light in a way that felt almost taunting. 2 tickets. Orchestra seats. To La Traviata. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity. My breath caught somewhere between my throat and chest. He hated opera. Hated it. The wailing, the drama, the absurdity of it all, he'd said once, rolling his eyes when I suggested we go. I remember laughing it off, teasing him about his lack of culture, but deep down it stung. Opera was something I loved. It moved me in a way nothing else did. But for him it was an unendurable chore. And yet here were 2 tickets right in our kitchen for a performance next Saturday. My mind raced as I tried to piece together a plausible explanation. A gift for a colleague, perhaps? No, he wasn't the type. Maybe a mistake? But the dates, the time, everything was meticulously correct. And there were 2 tickets. Not 1. 2. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I made dinner, went through the motions, pretending not to notice how perfectly normal he seemed. We talked about the usual work, errands, the leaky faucet in the bathroom. I wanted to ask, to confront him, but the words stayed trapped. Instead I waited. Saturday arrived, and with it, a suffocating weight in my chest. He left the house at 6, dressed sharper than I'd seen him in months. His charcoal suit was pressed, his tie perfectly knotted, and he even wore cologne. For what? I wanted to scream. Instead, I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and waited 5 minutes after he pulled out of the driveway before grabbing my coat. The drive to the opera house was short, but every red light felt like a personal attack. My palms were sweaty on the wheel, and my stomach churned with a mix of dread and anticipation. Who would she be? Someone from work? A woman I didn't know? Or worse, one I did. I parked a block away and walked briskly to the entrance, careful to keep my distance. My heart pounded in my ears as I scanned the crowd. He was easy to spot, his height and broad shoulders making him stand out even in a sea of suits and gowns. But it wasn't him I was looking for. It was her. And then I saw them. My breath caught as a familiar figure stepped into view, linking her arm through his. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. She was elegant, her silver hair pinned in an elaborate updo, her floor-length dress shimmering under the streetlights. I blinked, my stomach flipping as recognition hit me like a freight train. It wasn't a mistress. It was his mother. I froze, the world around me blurring as I stared at them. She was laughing, her face lit up with a joy I hadn't seen in years, and he was smiling, a real genuine smile. Not the tired, polite one he usually gave me after a long day, but something softer, warmer. My legs felt like lead as I stood there, watching them disappear through the grand doors of the opera house. The tickets, the suit, the cologne, it all made sense now. He wasn't hiding an affair. He was spending time with her. My chest tightened, shame mixing with the relief that flooded through me. How had I missed it? How had I let my insecurities paint such an ugly picture? He'd been so distant lately, so preoccupied, and instead of asking him what was wrong, I jumped to the worst conclusion. I thought about going home, pretending I hadn't followed him, but my feet carried me forward. I bought the cheapest ticket available, slipping into the back of the theater just as the lights dimmed. From my seat I could see them clearly. She leaned over to whisper something to him, and he nodded, his eyes focused on the stage as the first notes of the overture filled the room. I didn't watch the performance. Instead I watched them, his hand resting protectively on hers, the way they shared a program, the quiet moments of connection I'd forgotten he was capable of. When the final curtain fell, I slipped out before they could see me. The drive home was quiet, my emotions a tangled mess of guilt, gratitude, and something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Later that night, when he came home, I asked him how his evening was. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine, and then he told me. She always loved opera, he said softly. It reminds her of Dad. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to apologize, to tell him I understood now, but instead I reached for his hand. He looked surprised, but he didn't pull away. Maybe next time, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. We could all go together. For the first time in weeks, his smile reached his eyes. And for the first time in months, I felt like we weren't so far apart. The days that followed felt lighter, but not without an undercurrent of tension. The memory of that evening stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. I replayed the moment I saw them together, the look on his face, content, almost boyish in its simplicity. How long had it been since I'd seen him like that? How long had it been since I'd made him feel that way? I tried to push those thoughts aside to focus on the quiet shift between us. It wasn't dramatic, not the sweeping reconciliation I might have imagined, but it was there. A softening in the way he looked at me, a gentler tone in his voice when he asked about my day. And I, in turn, found myself reaching out in small, almost imperceptible ways. An extra squeeze of his hand, a laugh at one of his bad jokes. The things I'd stopped doing without realizing it. But beneath the surface, doubt still lingered. Was this enough? Could these small gestures bridge the distance that had grown between us over the years? One evening, as we sat together on the couch, him reading the news on his tablet, me thumbing through a magazine, I decided to test the waters. You know, I began, keeping my tone casual. I've been thinking about what you said. About your mom and opera. He glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly. Yeah. I think it's really nice that you're spending time with her like that. She must really appreciate it. His expression softened, and he set the tablet aside. She does. It's been hard for her since Dad passed. I think she feels like she's losing little pieces of him every day. Opera was their thing, you know? I nodded, my chest tightening. I had no idea. I didn't either, not at first. She never talked about it. But a few months ago she mentioned how much she missed going, and I figured. He trailed off, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. It's a good thing you're doing. She's lucky to have you. For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Finally I took a deep breath. I'd like to come with you next time, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. If that's okay. His eyes widened, and for a second I thought he might refuse. But then he smiled, a small, almost shy smile, and nodded. I think she'd like that. I would too. The next few weeks were a blur of careful planning and quiet anticipation. He called his mother, who seemed thrilled at the idea of me joining them. I spent hours agonizing over what to wear, wanting to strike the perfect balance between elegant and approachable. When the night finally arrived, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness I hadn't experienced in years. We picked her up from her apartment, and I was struck by how beautiful she looked, her silver hair framing her face like a halo. She greeted me warmly, her smile genuine, and I felt a pang of guilt for ever having doubted her. The drive to the opera house was filled with stories of her youth, anecdotes about her and my father-in-law's early days together. She painted vivid pictures of their adventures, sneaking into dress rehearsals, picnicking on the theater steps during intermissions. I found myself laughing along, her joy infectious. When we arrived, the three of us walked arm in arm through the grand entrance. For the first time in a long time I felt like I belonged, like we were a team. The performance that night was Carmen, a tale of love, betrayal, and passion. As the music swelled and the voices soared, I couldn't help but steal glances at my husband and his mother. He watched the stage with rapt attention, his hand resting lightly on hers, and I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about her or even about honoring his father's memory. This was about reconnecting with something deeper, something he'd lost along the way. And maybe, just maybe, it was about helping me find my way back too. After the final curtain call, we lingered in the lobby, soaking in the afterglow of the performance. She gushed about the soprano's voice, the costumes, the set design. My husband nodded along, his smile never wavering, and I felt a warmth spreading through me. A quiet, hopeful sense that things were changing. As we drove her home, she reached over and patted my hand. "Thank you for coming, dear," she said softly. "It means a lot to me. To both of us." Her words stayed with me long after we dropped her off and drove home in comfortable silence. When we finally crawled into bed that night, I turned to him, my heart pounding. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, the words tumbling over themselves. "For not noticing. For not asking. For..." He stopped me with a kiss, his hand cupping my cheek. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're here now. That's what matters. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. The days stretched into weeks, and something unspoken began to shift between us. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. No grand gestures, no sweeping confessions. Instead, it was in the little things. The way he lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, helping to chop vegetables even though he hated it. The way he'd brush his hand against mine as we passed each other in the hallway. The way we started laughing again. At things that weren't even funny. Just moments we shared that felt light and real. I began to wonder if this fragile truce between us could last, or if it was just a temporary reprieve from the cracks that had formed over the years. We had been so good at coexisting, at living side by side without truly seeing each other. The opera night had been a catalyst, but could it really undo all the distance that had settled between us like dust? One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the closet in our spare room, I stumbled across a photo album I hadn't seen in years. It was buried under a pile of old winter coats, its leather cover worn and cracked at the edges. I sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the pages, and there we were. Younger versions of ourselves, grinning and carefree, arms wrapped around each other like we couldn't imagine a world where we weren't connected. There was a picture from our first trip to the beach, the wind whipping my hair into my face as he tried to hold the camera steady. Another from our first Christmas together, me in an ugly sweater he'd bought as a joke, him laughing so hard his eyes were crinkled shut. Page after page of memories, each one a reminder of the life we'd built. The love we'd shared before routine and stress and silence had crept in. I didn't hear him come in until he was standing behind me, looking over my shoulder. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice soft. "Buried under about 10 pounds of coats," I said, smiling faintly. "I forgot we even had this." He sat down beside me, his knee brushing against mine as he reached for the album. Together we flipped through the pages, pausing now and then to laugh or reminisce. When we reached the last page, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We were happy," he said quietly. "Weren't we?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "We were." He looked down at the album, running his fingers over the edge of the photo. "I missed that," he admitted. His honesty caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. Finally, I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. "We can find it again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can't we?" He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years: hope. "I think so," he said. "If we're both willing to try." And so we did. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the weight of everything, the past, the unspoken hurts, the fear of failing, threatened to pull us under. But we kept going step by step, rebuilding what we'd almost lost. We started making time for each other in ways we hadn't before. Friday nights became sacred, a time to disconnect from work and distractions and simply be together. Sometimes we'd go out, a new restaurant, a movie, a concert. Other times we'd stay in, cooking dinner side by side, laughing as we danced around the kitchen to old songs. One evening, he surprised me by bringing home tickets to another opera. It wasn't for his mother this time. It was for us. I stared at the tickets, then at him, my heart swelling with something I couldn't quite name. "You said you loved it," he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. But I saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he waited for my reaction. I threw my arms around him, holding him tight. "Thank you," I whispered. "This means so much to me." That night at the opera, as the music swelled and the performers poured their hearts into every note, I found myself glancing at him. He wasn't enraptured the way I was. Opera would never be his passion, but he was present. He was there because it mattered to me, because I mattered to him. And in that moment I realized something I hadn't before. Love isn't about grand gestures or sweeping romance. It's about the small, quiet choices we make every day. The decision to show up, to listen, to try, even when it's hard. After the performance, as we walked hand in hand through the bustling city streets, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we were trying. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Life didn't magically transform after that night. There were still arguments, still moments of doubt and frustration. But there was also laughter and connection, and the growing certainty that we were stronger together than we ever could be apart. Months turned into years, and those Friday nights remained ours. We filled them with new traditions, new memories, a new sense of us. And every so often we'd return to the opera, not because it was his thing, but because it was ours now, a reminder of where we'd been and how far we'd come. Looking back, I realized the tickets I found that day were more than just an invitation to a performance. They were a turning point, a chance to see him in a new light, to rediscover the man I'd fallen in love with. And in the end, they were a reminder that even the most fractured relationships can be mended, as long as both people are willing to meet each other halfway. So here we are years later, still learning, still growing, still choosing each other every single day. And for that, I'll always be grateful. As time moved forward, the rhythms of our life began to intertwine again, not in the frantic, desperate way they might have when we were younger, but in a quieter, steadier rhythm that spoke of two people learning how to truly see each other again. The opera nights became a cherished tradition, not frequent but significant. Each time we went, it felt like we were adding another stitch to the fabric of our mending relationship, reinforcing the bond that had been so fragile not long ago. His mother joined us occasionally, her presence a warm reminder of the origins of this unexpected journey. She would recount her memories of my father-in-law with a wistful smile, her stories rich with details of a love that had weathered decades. Watching her, I often wondered if she saw her younger self in me, if she recognized the same struggles and triumphs in my marriage that she had once faced. One evening after the opera, as we sipped coffee in her cozy living room, she reached for my hand. Her touch was gentle, but her gaze was piercing, as if she were searching for something in my eyes. "You know," she said softly, "every marriage has its seasons. There are springs when everything feels fresh and new, and summers when love feels easy and abundant. But there are also winters when it feels like everything is cold and still. The trick is to remember that winter doesn't last forever. Spring always comes back, if you're willing to wait for it." Her words stayed with me long after that night. They were simple, almost cliché, and yet they carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. Over the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on her wisdom, on the idea that love wasn't about avoiding the winters but about enduring them together. It gave me a strange sense of comfort, knowing that the struggles we'd faced weren't unique or insurmountable. They were simply a part of the cycle. The winter in our marriage began to thaw in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. We started carving out time for long walks in the park, where we'd talk about everything and nothing. He began asking me about the books I was reading, genuinely curious about my thoughts, and I in turn took a newfound interest in his work, in the projects that lit a spark in his eyes. We rediscovered the pleasure of simply being in each other's company, without the weight of expectations or unspoken grievances. There was one moment, though, that stands out among the others, a moment that felt like a turning point, a crystallization of all the work we'd been doing to rebuild our connection. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the world outside felt hushed and unhurried. We were sitting on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn, and for once, there was no rush to be anywhere or do anything. Out of nowhere, he turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low. "Of course," I replied, my heart quickening slightly. He hesitated, as if weighing his words, before finally meeting my gaze. "Do you ever think about how we almost lost this? Us?" The question caught me off guard, not because it wasn't something I'd thought about, but because it wasn't something we'd ever said out loud. I took a deep breath, considering my answer. He admitted. "But I also think about how we didn't, how we found our way back." He nodded, his eyes softening. "I don't think I ever told you how scared I was," he said. "Scared that we were too far gone, that I'd lost you." "You never lost me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "We just forgot how to find each other for a while." He reached for my hand then, his grip warm and steady. "I don't ever want to forget again," he said simply. And in that moment, sitting there in the golden light of an autumn morning, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the giddy, head-over-heels infatuation of our early days, nor was it the quiet resignation of the years we'd spent drifting apart. It was something deeper, something rooted in the understanding that love isn't always easy or perfect, but it's worth fighting for. The seasons of our marriage continued to turn, as seasons always do. There were still challenges, still moments of frustration and misunderstanding, but there was also a resilience that hadn't been there before. We learned to lean on each other in ways we hadn't in years, to communicate openly and honestly, even when it was uncomfortable. We became partners again, not just in the day-to-day logistics of life, but in the deeper, more meaningful sense of the word. As time went on, we began to create new traditions, new memories that were uniquely ours. We took up cooking together, experimenting with recipes that often ended in laughter and the occasional disaster. We planned weekend getaways to places we'd never been, rediscovering the thrill of adventure and the joy of simply being together. And of course, we continued to attend the opera. Each performance a reminder of how far we'd come and how much we still had to look forward to. Looking back now, I realize that finding those tickets was one of the best things that ever happened to us. At the time, it felt like a betrayal, a confirmation of my worst fears. But in reality, it was a wake-up call. A chance to confront the cracks in our marriage and decide whether we were willing to fight for each other. And fight we did. Today, as I sit here writing this, he's in the kitchen, humming off-key as he prepares breakfast. The smell of freshly brewed coffee fills the air, and I can hear the soft clatter of plates as he sets the table. It's an ordinary moment, unremarkable in the grand scheme of things, and yet it feels extraordinary, because it's ours. And after everything we've been through, that feels like the greatest gift of all. The sound of his humming carries through the house, a gentle and perfect melody that makes me smile despite myself. It's one of those moments that feels suspended in time, where nothing else matters but the quiet, comforting presence of the person you've chosen to share your life with. I let the feeling wash over me, allowing myself to savor it, because I know now how precious these moments are. They're the threads that hold us together, the quiet proof of a bond that has weathered storms and come out stronger on the other side. As I join him in the kitchen, he glances up and grins, a playful glint in his eye. "You're just in time," he says, gesturing toward the pan on the stove. "I'm attempting to make eggs the way you like them. No promises, though." I laugh, leaning against the counter as I watch him work. "You know, it's okay if they're not perfect," I say. "It's the effort that counts." He glances at me, his expression softening. "Well, in that case, you should know I'm putting in a lot of effort." We share a smile, the kind that feels easy and natural, as though the years of tension and miscommunication have melted away. It's moments like this that remind me why we fought so hard to rebuild what we had. Love isn't just about the grand gestures or the big milestones. It's about the little things, the everyday acts of care and connection that remind you why you chose each other in the first place. After breakfast, we settle into the day, each of us tending to our own tasks. He spends the morning in the garage, tinkering with a project he's been working on for weeks, while I curl up on the couch with a book. The house is quiet except for the faint hum of the radio playing in the background, and I find myself feeling grateful for the stillness. There was a time when silence felt heavy, almost oppressive, a reminder of everything we weren't saying to each other. Now it feels like a shared space, a comfortable pause between moments. By the time afternoon rolls around, we're both ready for a break. He suggests a walk and I agree, eager to soak in the crisp autumn air. The park is alive with the vibrant colors of fall, reds and golds and oranges that seem to glow in the soft light. We walk side by side, our hands occasionally brushing, and it strikes me how natural this feels, how right? As we reach a bench overlooking the lake, he sits down and pulls me close, his arm draped over my shoulders. For a while we simply sit there, watching the water ripple in the breeze. It's the kind of moment that doesn't need words, but he breaks the silence anyway. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asks, his voice thoughtful. "All the time," I admit. "Sometimes it feels like we're completely different people than we were back then." He nods, a small smile playing at his lips. "I think we are. And I think that's a good thing." I rest my head against his shoulder, letting his words sink in. He's right, we are different. The people we were when we first met, when we fell in love, when we almost lost each other, aren't the same as the people we are now. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Love isn't static. It grows and changes just like we do. And if you're willing to adapt, to evolve together, it can become something even stronger, even more meaningful. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, we make our way back home. The evening unfolds in its usual way, Dinner, a little TV, the comfortable routines that make up the fabric of our lives. But there's a warmth to it, an ease that wasn't there before, and it fills me with a quiet kind of joy. Later that night, as we're getting ready for bed, he pauses in the doorway of our room, watching me with an expression I can't quite read. "What is it?" I ask, raising an eyebrow. He steps closer, his hands resting on my shoulders. "I just wanted to say thank you," he says softly. "For what?" I ask, genuinely surprised. "For sticking with me," he replies. "For giving us a second chance." I feel my throat tighten, emotion welling up inside me. "You don't have to thank me," I say. "We both fought for this. We both made it happen." He smiles then, a smile so full of love and gratitude that it takes my breath away. "Well, I'm still grateful," he says. "For you. For us." As we climb into bed, the room bathed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I find myself thinking back to the day I found those tickets. At the time it felt like the beginning of the end, a sign that everything I'd feared was coming true. But now I see it for what it really was. The start of a new chapter, a chance to rebuild something even better than what we had before. I turn to him, my hand finding his under the covers. "I'm grateful too," I whisper, and I mean it with every fiber of my being. We drift off to sleep like that, hand in hand, the quiet hum of the world outside a gentle reminder that life, like love, is always moving forward. And as I close my eyes, I feel a sense of peace, knowing that no matter what challenges come our way, we'll face them together. Always. The days began to blend together in a way that didn't feel monotonous but comforting, like the rhythmic turning of pages in a well-loved book. Every moment, no matter how small, seemed to hold a deeper meaning now. The way he would leave a mug of coffee for me on the counter before I even woke up. The way I'd catch him humming absent-mindedly as he worked on his latest project. The way we'd find ourselves laughing over dinner, the kind of laughter that comes from truly enjoying each other's company. It wasn't that life had suddenly become perfect. There were still frustrations, still disagreements, still the occasional silence. But there was a resilience in us now, a shared understanding that we were stronger together than apart. One evening, a few weeks after that autumn walk in the park, I was cleaning up in the kitchen when he called out from the living room. His voice had that particular tone it got when he was nervous but trying not to show it. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked in to find him standing by the coffee table, holding a small, unassuming envelope. "What's this?" I asked, glancing from the envelope to his face. He smiled a little sheepishly and handed it to me. "Open it and see." I raised an eyebrow but did as he asked, sliding my finger under the flap and pulling out what looked like another set of tickets. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded them, my eyes scanning the words printed neatly across the front. It wasn't an opera this time but a weekend getaway. A trip to the mountains, complete with a cabin rental and a promise of crisp air, scenic hikes, and quiet evenings by the fire. "You did this?" I asked, my voice soft with surprise. He nodded, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I figured it's been a while since we had a real escape. Just the two of us. Thought it might be nice." I stared at the tickets, my mind already conjuring images of the two of us surrounded by towering pines, the world falling away until it was just us. "It's more than nice," I said, looking up at him. "It's perfect." The weekend arrived sooner than I expected, and before I knew it, we were loading our bags into the trunk and setting off on the winding drive to the mountains. The air grew cooler as we climbed higher, the landscape transforming from sprawling suburbs to dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over everything. The cabin itself was cozy and inviting, its wooden beams and stone fireplace giving it a rustic charm that immediately put me at ease. We spent the evening unpacking, cooking a simple dinner together, and settling into the quiet rhythm of the place. Outside, the night was so still that it felt like the entire world had paused, leaving only the two of us in our little bubble of warmth and light. The next morning, we ventured out onto one of the hiking trails that wound through the forest behind the cabin. The air was crisp and clean, the kind that made you feel alive with every breath. We walked in companionable silence, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. Occasionally, he'd point out a particularly interesting tree or a distant mountain peak, and I'd nod, taking it all in. It was at the top of the trail, standing on a rocky outcrop with a breathtaking view of the valley below, that he turned to me with a look I couldn't quite place. "You know," he began, his voice quiet, "I've been thinking a lot about us lately." I tilted my head, watching him carefully. "What about us?" He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "About how far we've come, how much we've been through, and how I don't want to take any of it for granted anymore." His words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, and I felt my throat tighten. "Neither do I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against the chill of the air. "I know I've made mistakes," he said. "I know there were times when I wasn't the husband you deserved. But I want you to know. I see you now. I see everything you've done for us, everything you've sacrificed. And I'm so grateful." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I didn't bother wiping it away. "You've always been enough," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "Even when it was hard, even when I doubted myself, you were always enough." For a long moment we stood there, the world around us quiet and still, the weight of everything unsaid finally lifting. It wasn't a grand declaration or a dramatic turning point. It was simply two people acknowledging the love they'd fought so hard to hold on to, the love that had carried them through the darkest of times. The rest of the weekend was a blur of quiet moments that felt impossibly precious. Cooking breakfast together in the tiny kitchen, sitting by the fire with mugs of hot cocoa, watching the stars from the porch as the cold night air wrapped around us. It wasn't just a getaway, it was a reminder of everything we'd built, everything we were still building. When we returned home, life resumed its usual pace, but something was different. There was a lightness between us, a sense of connection that hadn't been there in years. The little gestures that had once felt like effort now came naturally. A kiss on the cheek as he left for work, a text in the middle of the day just to say he was thinking of me, the way his hand would find mine whenever we were close enough to touch. And as the months turned into years, that connection only grew stronger. There were still challenges, still moments of frustration and doubt, but they no longer felt insurmountable. We had learned how to weather the winters together, how to find the warmth in even the coldest of days. Looking back, I often think about those tickets to the opera, the ones that started it all. At the time, they felt like a harbinger of everything I feared most, a sign that my world was about to crumble. But in the end, they were a gift. A chance to see my husband in a new light, to rediscover the man I fell in love with and the love that had been there all along, waiting for us to find our way back to it. And now, as I sit here writing this, the sound of his laughter drifting in from the other room, I feel nothing but gratitude, for the journey, for the lessons, and for the life we've built together. It's not perfect. Never will be. But it's ours, and that's more than enough. The passing years brought with them a deepening of our bond, not in the way a sudden spark might light a fire, but in the way embers glow steadily, giving warmth even in the coldest nights. The opera nights that had once been a rare occasion became a regular part of our lives. Each performance held a quiet significance, a reminder of where we had been and how far we had come. Even when his mother eventually became unable to join us due to her health, she would smile when we'd tell her about the evenings, as though she knew the role she had played in bringing us back together. Life didn't stop presenting its challenges, of course. There were still hard days, moments when stress crept in or when the past tried to cast shadows over our present. But those moments no longer felt insurmountable. We'd built a foundation stronger than before, one that could withstand the storms. I began to understand that love isn't just about the good times. It's about showing up day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. One night, as we sat together after dinner, the room lit by the soft glow of the fireplace, he surprised me by pulling out a small box. It wasn't wrapped, just a simple velvet case that he turned over in his hands a few times before holding it out to me. "What's this?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "Open it," he said, his voice steady but his eyes holding a flicker of nerves. I opened the box to find a delicate silver bracelet, the kind of thing that seemed almost too beautiful to wear every day. Tiny charms dangled from it, each one representing something meaningful. A small opera mask, a mountain, a tiny book, a star. Each charm was a piece of our story, a reminder of the moments that had brought us here. "It's not for a special occasion or anything," he said quickly, as though explaining. I wanted you to have something to remind you of how much all of this means to me. How much you mean to me. Tears pricked my eyes and I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. It's perfect, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Thank you. He smiled, his relief evident, and helped me clasp the bracelet around my wrist. As I turned it in the light, watching it catch the glow of the fire, I realized how far we'd come. Not just as a couple, but as individuals who had learned how to meet each other halfway, how to honor not just the relationship but the person standing on the other side of it. The years that followed brought new chapters, some expected, others less so. We traveled more, exploring parts of the world we'd only ever talked about in passing. We found joy in the simplicity of shared routines, like Saturday morning trips to the farmer's market or quiet evenings spent reading together. And when his mother passed away peacefully in her sleep one winter night, we held each other through the grief, finding comfort in the memories she had left us and the legacy of love she had inspired. There was a moment years later when we stood together in the opera house, the same one where I had once followed him in secret, desperate to uncover the truth. The theater had become a second home of sorts, a place that symbolized not just art and music, but the resilience of our love. As the lights dimmed and the overture began, he leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I turned to him, my heart swelling with a mix of emotions. Thank you for giving me something worth holding on to. We watched the performance hand in hand, the music wrapping around us like a warm embrace. And in that moment, I realized that love isn't about never facing hardship or doubt. It's about choosing each other again and again, even when it would be easier to walk away. It's about seeing the flaws and imperfections and deciding they're worth it because of everything else, the laughter, the connection, the quiet moments of understanding. As the years continued to pass, our lives were filled with 1,000 little moments that seemed unremarkable on their own, but wove together into something extraordinary. A picnic in the park on a sunny afternoon. The way he'd leave little notes for me to find, tucked into my book or taped to the bathroom mirror. The sound of his laughter when I told him a story from my day. The feel of his hand in mine as we navigated whatever life threw at us. Even as we grew older, as the years began to leave their marks on our faces and our bodies, there was a lightness between us. A shared history that felt like an invisible thread connecting us no matter where we were. Our love had evolved, deepened, become something both quieter and more powerful. It was no longer the kind of love that burned bright and fast, but the kind that sustained, that endured. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me with a look of quiet contentment. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" he asked. "All the time," I said, smiling. "And I'm glad it did. Even the hard parts." "Me too," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I think it made us stronger." I reached for his hand, holding it tightly. It did. And it made me realize that no matter what happens, we'll always find our way back to each other. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft golden glow. And as we sat there side by side, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that our story was far from over. It would continue to unfold, one quiet, beautiful moment at a time, as long as we were willing to keep choosing each other. And I knew with absolute certainty that we always would. The years continued their steady march, and with them came the inevitable changes of life. Our hair turned silver, our steps slowed, and the once hectic pace of our days softened into a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. Yet through it all our bond remained. A constant thread woven through the fabric of our lives, holding us together in a way that felt both unshakable and tender. The opera remained a cornerstone of our shared world. Each performance we attended was like revisiting an old friend, a place where the weight of time seemed to melt away, leaving only the music and the memories it carried. We still sat hand in hand during the overtures, still exchanged glances during particularly moving arias, still whispered our thoughts to each other during intermissions. It was a ritual, a tradition that had grown with us, becoming as much a part of our story as the laughter, the arguments, and the quiet moments of love that defined our years together. One particular evening stands out in my mind. It was a crisp winter night, the kind where the air feels sharp and clean, and the city sparkled under a fresh layer of snow. We had tickets to a performance of Madama Butterfly, a favorite of mine that he had come to appreciate over the years. The theater was as grand as ever, its chandeliers casting a warm golden light over the crowd as we made our way to our seats. As the orchestra began to play, I found myself watching him more than the stage. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners as he listened, the faint smile that tugged at his lips during the overture. It was a quiet reminder of how much he had changed, how much we both had. He had once told me he couldn't understand opera, that it was too dramatic, too over the top. And now here he was completely absorbed in the story, as if he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. At intermission we wandered out to the lobby, sipping champagne and watching the snow fall softly through the grand windows. He leaned against the railing, his gaze distant as though lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, nudging him gently. He turned to me, his eyes warm and full of something I couldn't quite name. "Just how lucky I am," he said simply. The words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But then I smiled, reaching for his hand. "Me too," I said. It was such a small moment, a quiet exchange in a sea of people, but it stayed with me long after the final curtain fell. It was a reminder of how far we'd come, of the life we'd built together, and of the love that had carried us through every challenge, every joy, every moment in between. As we grew older, our traditions began to shift and adapt to the realities of aging. The long hikes we once loved gave way to shorter walks through the park. Our bustling kitchen experiments turned into simpler meals shared at the table, accompanied by stories of our day. And though our visits to the opera became less frequent, they never lost their magic. Each performance felt like a celebration, a testament to the journey we had shared, and the love that continued to grow between us. Eventually, the day came when we both knew our time at the opera house was coming to an end. It wasn't a dramatic decision, just an understanding that the energy it took to navigate the crowds and the long nights was becoming too much. But even then, we found a way to keep the music alive in our lives. We began watching recordings of performances at home, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a glass of wine, the glow of the screen casting a soft light over the room. It wasn't the same as being there, but it was enough. It was ours. One evening, as we watched a particularly moving rendition of La Traviata, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you remember the first time you saw those opera tickets?" he asked. I laughed softly, the memory rushing back like it had happened yesterday. How could I forget? I thought my whole world was falling apart. He chuckled, shaking his head. And instead, it brought us here. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said, his voice soft. "It is." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own lessons and gifts. We celebrated milestones together. Anniversaries, birthdays, the births of grandchildren who filled our lives with a new kind of love. We mourned losses too, saying goodbye to friends and family members who had been part of our journey. But through it all we had each other. And that was enough. As I sit here now in the quiet of our home, I find myself reflecting on the life we've shared. The laughter, the tears, the moments of doubt and the moments of certainty. It's all part of the story. A tapestry woven from the threads of a love that refused to be broken. There's a photograph on the table beside me, one that I find myself looking at often. It's from that first opera night we attended together, the one where I followed him, convinced I was uncovering a betrayal. In the picture, we're standing in the lobby of the theater, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling at the camera. I remember how I felt in that moment, confused, hopeful, unsure of what the future held. And now looking back, I realize I had no idea just how much that night would change everything. The opera tickets that once symbolized my worst fears became the beginning of something beautiful, something stronger than I ever could have imagined. They taught me that love isn't about perfection or ease. It's about resilience, about choosing each other over and over again, no matter what. And as I sit here, the sounds of a familiar aria playing softly in the background, I know with all my heart that I would choose him again. Every time. Forever. The house is quiet now, the kind of stillness that only comes with the passing of time. The once bustling rooms filled with the echoes of laughter, conversations and life, have settled into a peaceful calm. I sit in my favorite chair by the window, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside me, and watch the world outside. The trees sway gently in the breeze, their golden leaves catching the afternoon light, and I find myself thinking, as I often do these days, about the life we've built and the memories we've gathered along the way. It amazes me how time has a way of blurring the edges of certain moments while sharpening others into perfect clarity, vast and beautifully simple. As we sip our tea, he reaches across the table and takes my hand. His fingers are warm, a little rough from years of work, but steady and sure. "I've been thinking," he says softly, his eyes meeting mine. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" I nod, my throat tightening with emotion. "The best," I whisper. "Better than I ever could have imagined." His smile deepens, and for a moment we sit there in silence, the weight of those words settling between us. It's not just a reflection. It's a quiet acknowledgement of everything we've shared, everything we've built together. The life we've lived, with all its twists and turns, has been ours, and that alone makes it perfect. As the last light of the day fades and the room is bathed in the soft glow of the lamp on the table, I feel a deep sense of peace settle over me. Our story isn't about grand gestures or dramatic endings. It's about the small, everyday moments that have woven together to create something extraordinary. It's about the love that has carried us through it all, steady and unyielding, even when everything else felt uncertain. We finish our tea, and he helps me to my feet, his arm steadying me as we walk back to the living room. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, casting a gentle warmth over the room, and we settle onto the couch side by side. His arm wraps around me, and I rest my head on his shoulder, feeling the familiar rhythm of his breathing. As I close my eyes, I realize that our story doesn't need an ending. It's a part of something bigger, a love that will live on in the memories we've created and the lives we've touched. And as I drift off to sleep, his presence beside me is constant as the stars outside. I know with absolute certainty that this quiet, unassuming moment is everything I could ever need.